Today, I want to ask a question. Can a story that takes place 30 centuries ago teach us anything about business and politics in today? And some of you are thinking, no, let's go get coffee. I'm going to try and change your mind. The story that we've been reading for the last 3 weeks and today is this beautiful, thoughtful, poignant story out of the book of Ruth. And it centers on these two women, Ruth and Naomi. They're both widows and they're living in Bethlehem. And Naomi is from Bethlehem. Ruth is from Moab across the Jordan River. It's a foreign country. And they are there and they are destitute and they're surviving only on the kindness of others. And that's where our story picks up today. You see, there's Boaz who's this rich guy who's there. He's been very kind to them, and he wants to marry Ruth. But there's an obstacle. There's always an obstacle in these stories. And that's what I want to explore. Now, in order to get there, we got to do a little cultural anthropology here. There's a couple of pieces here, a couple of historical pieces, a couple of customs that if you don't get, it's not going to make sense. And let's just think of this as a field trip. And it's kind of like, you know, when you travel to a foreign country and you're like, well, this is different. Okay? It's going to be a little different. There's two things to understand. First of all, when somebody, you didn't actually own the land in ancient Israel. The way it was thought of is God owned the land and your family was the steward of it. And you didn't sell the land if you needed the money. You sold the rights to the harvest. And the idea being is every 49 years, at the year of Jubilee, it would roll back to whoever originally owned the land. So if you were destitute, if you needed to get rid of this, if you really needed the money, what you would do is you would have a kinsman redeemer or somebody from your clan, whoever was closest, would buy that land. But that actually puts in the next piece of it. There's this really interesting custom. And the way it worked is if you had somebody from your clan who died before they had any sons, somebody else from the clan would be responsible for marrying their widow. And that way the land would stay in the clan and the widows wouldn't starve, and then any children out of that union would then technically, legally, be the son of the dead guy. All right, let me give you an example just to make this clear. I'm an only child, but let's pretend I have a brother. And my brother gets married and he dies. I'm then responsible for marrying his widow, and any children out of that union are technically sons of my dead brother. You with me? Okay? I know, it's a little strange, it's a little different, but we don't want to judge. I mean, if they looked at us, they'd say, okay, you have a device that has access to all the world's knowledge in your pocket, and yet you use it to look at cat pictures. We're not going to judge, okay? It was a way to preserve the land, preserve the family, and that was the solution they had. So the thing is Boaz wants to marry Ruth, but there's somebody with a better claim. Somebody who's got a better right to the land and a better right to marry Ruth closer to that family. It's not laid out exactly how it is, but this is a small town and all these people are related. So perhaps it's a cousin who's closer or a generation closer. We don't know. Doesn't really matter. We know there's somebody who's got a better right than Boaz. Now, Boaz is a smart guy, and he's an honorable guy. So what he does is he goes to the town gates. And the gates in those days were where everybody hung out. It's where you bought and sold stuff. It's where you witnessed contracts. It's where you did everything. And he waits. And sure enough, this guy shows up. And he says, hey, you know Naomi's back in town. Do you want to redeem her land? Do you want to buy that? And he's like, yeah, I could do that. And then Boaz is like, okay, but you know, if you do that, you got to take Ruth too. And the guy's like, oh, I can't do that. Now, nobody's quite sure, but the informed speculation seems to be that the plot of land that Naomi has from her dead husband's family is kind of small. Maybe it's just enough to support support Naomi, not Naomi plus Ruth plus kids. And so the guy's like, well, if I marry her, my own family isn't going to be able to support all these other people, and this land isn't enough, so I can't do it. And so he says, fine, you go ahead and do it. And so Boaz, he's like, I'm not wasting any time. Give me your sandal. Let's do this thing. Because as you just heard Penny read, the custom in that time was you traded sandals. And it's interesting because we don't know who wrote the book of Ruth, but it was written sometime later, because you get this interesting little aside where the author of Ruth says, back in those days, this is how we did it. Again, as I always say, the past is a foreign country, and sometimes the past is a foreign country even to the people who wrote the Bible. So here's the situation. Boaz now buys the land, gets the right to marry Ruth. And that's where the story ends, except for one little thing. But I want to ask this question: what do we have to learn from this? And I want to take a look at the character of Boaz for the next few minutes. Because everything that we see, every opportunity he has, he does the right thing. And it's not him earning God's love. It's him working out of a reaction to God loving him. It's a reaction to him. It's Boaz responding to God, being gracious to him. He's in this place where this is a bloody, uncertain time, but he's still doing all right. He's still got land. He's able to feed his people. And he's working in this place where he has a number of opportunities to take advantage of people, to take advantage of Ruth's situation, to take advantage of Naomi's situation, to do all these things. And yet every time he is given the choice, he does the honorable thing in response to God's love. So I want to think about that for a minute. I'm going to give you 3 different stories to consider. First thing is, I'm subscribed to Christianity Today, which is a really interesting magazine, and I really enjoy it. And one of the things I really enjoy about it is the back page, every issue, is a testimony column. And it's the story of how somebody came to faith. And there was a really powerful one I was reading this week. And it was a guy who was a police officer. And it was the classic thing of, and we've all seen this movie, where somebody professionally is doing really well, and as they climb that ladder professionally, their personal life falls apart. So at the same time, he's getting promoted and promoted and promoted, and ends up as the head of the narcotics task force. His wife leaves him, his daughter has health issues, he's struggling with depression and health issues. He's just got this huge disconnect between where he is professionally and where he's at personally. And the story he tells is he said he had been working with this private investigator. And when the private investigator needed a favor, like running records, running stuff through the police database, that sort of thing, he would do it for him. He said it wasn't a big deal, nobody got hurt, everybody was doing it, it was one of those things. And then one time, the private investigator says, I need some money. Why don't you get me some of the drugs that you've seized and we'll sell it? And he's like, I can't do that. That's illegal. And the private investigator says, well, if you don't do that, I will tell the police chief that you've been running records for me and you'll get fired. And he's like, okay, I'll do it. Now the problem was, what neither he nor the private investigator knew was the feds were already on to the private investigator. So as soon as they went to sell those drugs, they both got arrested. And he said, that's what hit rock bottom for me. Now, I tell you that because that tells us something important. And we've all seen this, where you think, I'll just do this little thing and there's no consequences. But the thing is, you do that little thing and it brings into the next thing, and it brings in the next thing, and it brings in the next thing, and it brings in the next thing. You don't just go with that one thing. It keeps pushing you down. And you get told this lie that, well, I've done this one thing and I'll stop here. But really what it is, I've done this one thing, I might as well do the next thing. Let me tell you another story. A lot of you know way back when I was working at Nordstrom's and selling shoes. And I remember I had this coworker. And this coworker spent a couple hours working with this guy one afternoon. And he had this sale all lined up. Got the guy sized up, got everything set, he's got the shoes, the whole 9 yards. And the customer says, great, I want to buy these, but I'm going to come back tonight at the after hours event and I'll buy them then when I buy all this other stuff. Because this is Nordstrom's and I'm not, never gone in Nordstrom except when I was working there. Loved the place, but way more expensive than I'd normally spend. And they would have these after-hours events for the people with a lot of money. And so this guy was saying, I will come back tonight and get it when we've got the after-hours event. And my coworker is like, okay, fine. And so he takes the shoes, puts them on the hold shelf with his sales number on it, so whoever's ringing it up that night can ring it up under his number, as they do. Next morning, he comes in, he checks the sales, and it's like, I didn't get credit for that sale. Looks at the hold shelf, shoes are gone. And he's like, somebody took my sale. And I mean, when you're working on commission, that's rent money somebody's taken from you. And he's like, I think I know who did it, but I can't prove it. And he's like, oh, what am I going to do with this? And he's frustrated, he's angry, he vents a little bit to me, but he doesn't do anything with it. A couple months later, the people he was suspecting did that to him got fired for pulling stuff like he suspected they were doing. And he says to me, you know what? If I had done what I wanted to do, which was try and steal their sales, try and do the same thing to them that they were doing to me, and loss prevention showed up, and I used that as a defense, saying, well, they did it to me first, so I was just retaliating, do you think it would have saved my job? It's like, no. I would have been out the door just as fast. And I tell you that story because it sets up something really clearly for us. It sets up this central question for us. And that question is, what standard do you want to be judged by? Do you want to be judged by the world standard, which is this retaliation, this tit for tat? Things have been done to me, therefore I am going to do them back to other people. Or do you want to be judged by God's standard, where he says, this is who you're supposed to be. This is who I have called you to be. Which standard do you want? Let's go back to history again. Not quite as ancient Israel, but let's go back a couple hundred years in English history. Any of y'all grew up grew up Methodist? Raise your hand. Anybody grew up Methodist? Okay. Only one of you who admits it. Okay. I think Methodists are awesome. My mother was Methodist, okay? That's cool. Here's one of the reasons I love Methodists, and I love the history. Back a couple hundred years ago, it was this time in England known as Gin Alley. And they were drinking 50 gallons of gin per year for every man, woman, and child in the nation of Israel. Now, I know we like to drink in Wisconsin, but even by Wisconsin standards, 50 gallons a year is a lot of gin, okay? That's a lot of gin. And the Methodists started to say, you know what? You can't worship God if you're falling down drunk. You can't be a witness for Christ if you're lying face down in the gutter in a pool of your own sick. This just does not work. And they said it's not a sin to have a drink, but it's a sin to be drunk. And they ended up reforming society, not by passing temperance laws, not by doing prohibition like we did here, but they said, we're going to be sober. And we're going to set an example for who we are and set an example by glorifying God by being able to walk a straight line. And so it became this huge reform in England. And it wasn't through any state action. It wasn't through passing any laws. But it happened organically, because what happened was, say you're a business owner and you need to hire a bookkeeper. Do you hire the Methodist guy who's sober and can actually walk a straight line? Or do you hire the guy who is soaked in gin? You're like, I'm going to hire the Methodist. And so it became this thing where people looked around and they said, you know, we want that. We don't like what this is doing to us. We don't like how this is destroying us. It becomes something new. And so, friends, I want us to remember that, to be like Boaz. And I want to take a minute here just to deal with our current state of our country, because we're swinging back into election season, or maybe we've been in it for the last 4 months. Because I don't know about you, but I must have Googled something wrong, and now I am getting every political ad in creation constantly. I can recite them all now. I hate it. Okay? And this is not a you should vote for this guy or you should vote for that guy. It's how do we talk about this? Because the temptation is to sink down to the lowest level, to sink down into the anger, sink down into the vitriol. But we're called to something higher. You see, Boaz was on to something that Jesus wouldn't say for another 1,000 years. 1,000 years after Boaz lived, Jesus says this. He says, look, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Be innocent as doves and wise as serpents. This is who we're called to be in every facet of our life. Whether it's business, whether it's politics, we're called to be better. It's not a sin to have a political opinion. You can have whatever opinion you want on capital gains tax, on immigration policy, any of those things. I'm not going to tell you what the Bible says on that, because I don't think there is a strict Bible position on any of those issues. But it is a sin to get angry, to bear false witness, to lie. We are called to love. And over the next couple of months, it's going to get angry in this state. There's going to be a lot of nasty ads, a lot of nasty bumper stickers, a lot of arguments. And my call and my reminder for all of you in this time is that you're called to love your neighbor. And if you tell me, yeah, but you don't know how bad it is, you don't know what they did to me, you don't know what those people think of me, I'm going to try and be good, but I really want to do a history lecture. Because think about it. When Paul writes that we're called to be more than conquerors, he's writing that from a place where the Romans persecuted Christians. When we look across time and history, Christians never had it as good as we do here. You go many places in the world and you get persecuted and disowned by your family for being a Christian. You go many places across time, and you get persecuted for being a Christian. We are called to love our neighbors and be good citizens. We are called to be salt and light. And yes, that's hard because some people that you run across are real jerks. Okay? Let's just be honest, they are. And political season brings out the worst in people. But what we're called to do is love them. There's this beautiful prayer. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It's known as the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. But it's not actually that old. It's only about 100 years old. But I just want to read this for you. And this is such a good way to think about what we're doing. Such a good way to think about what Boaz was doing. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring love. Where there is offense, let me bring pardon. Where there is discord, let me bring union. Where there is error, let me bring truth. Where there is doubt, let me bring faith. Where there's despair, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, let me bring your light. Where there is sadness, let me bring joy. O Master, let me not seek to console as much as not to be consoled as much to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that one receives, it is in self-forgetting that one finds, it is in pardoning that one is pardoned, it is in dying that one is raised to eternal life. So I want to encourage you this week to live like Boaz. Live a life of graciousness and honor when it feels like people around you aren't. And don't take that as a challenge to sink to their own level, to sink down to where they're at. But remember that you're called to a new life in response to what Jesus has done for you. Amen.